My name is Hannah Reeves. I am 38 years old. The morning my boss called me into the conference room to tell me I lacked the fundamental qualities of a leader, I had already been awake for 3 hours, tracing a network probe back to a spoofed server in Latvia, and my phone was vibrating in my blazer pocket with a call from a number I hadn't seen in 4 years, but recognized the way you recognize the sound of certain machinery below the thinking part of your brain before you've finished deciding that you recognize it. He was in the middle of explaining that leadership is about visibility, about raising your hand in meetings, about making sure the people above you can see you working. He had his hands folded on the laminate conference table and a pocket square that matched nothing else he was wearing, and the particular expression of a man who had practiced this speech in a mirror and was pleased with how it had come out. The woman from HR, Linda, had a yellow legal pad. She had written 4 words on it in blue ink. I could read them upside down across the table. Documentation. Policy. 30 days. Appeal. My phone vibrated again. I looked at the screen, 571 area code, Northern Virginia. I said, "Excuse me, I need to take this call." My boss, Derek Calloway, said we were in the middle of a formal review process and I could not simply walk out. I was already standing up. I walked out. What happened in that hallway is the reason I'm telling you this story. But you can't understand what was said on that phone call without knowing what I had been before. I was Hannah Reeves, 14-month employee of a mid-sized IT consulting firm in Chicago, the woman who apparently lacked the fundamental qualities of a leader. I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky. My mother taught 8th grade English, and my father drove delivery routes for a medical supply company until his back gave out, at which point he drove shorter routes for a different medical supply company. I was the kind of child who did not cause trouble in the ordinary ways. I didn't write on bathroom walls or run in the hallways or talk back to teachers. What I did was take things apart, not break them, disassemble them, methodically, laying each component in a grid on my bedroom floor until I understood how every piece connected to the piece beside it, and then put it back together. I did this with radios and alarm clocks, and at 13, the family desktop computer, which I disassembled on a Tuesday, understood on a Wednesday, and reassembled on a Thursday, running better than it had in months, because I had identified and removed a corrupted RAM chip that had been slowing the whole machine for a year. My mother said I should be an engineer. My father said I should find something that pays. My high school guidance counselor, a man named Mr. Tanner, who wore the same brown cardigan every Monday for 4 years, said almost as an afterthought that I should look into the military because the technical programs were getting very good. I don't know if he ever thought about it again. I thought about it every day for the next 8 months. I enlisted in the United States Army at 19. My mother drove me to the recruiting station and waited in the car. She didn't come in. She told me later she didn't come in because she knew that if she watched me sign the paperwork, she would say something that would embarrass both of us, and she had too much dignity for that. She had packed me a sandwich for the drive that I didn't eat. I still think about that sandwich sometimes. It was a thing she did when she was trying to say something she didn't have words for. I went into communications first, which was where they put people with my specific set of skills. Within 3 years, I had moved into what would eventually be formalized as Army Cyber Command. At the time, the field didn't have a clean name yet. It was a collection of very precise capabilities attached to a very precise problem. The world was digitalizing faster than any military doctrine could account for, and the people who understood the shape of that gap were not the people making decisions about how to close it. I understood the shape of the gap. I spent 9 years learning to close it in the only environments where the stakes are real. I did not have a traditional military career in the way people picture when they picture one. I was not in the field in the way that word usually means. I was in server rooms and classified facilities and windowless conference rooms with overhead lights that never dimmed, working on problems that were described to the public in very general terms, if they were described at all. I was in these rooms alongside people who were extraordinarily good at what they did and who shared a particular quality I have come to value above almost everything else, which is that they understood the difference between talking about what you know and actually knowing it. The thing about that distinction is that it's invisible until the moment it matters. People talk about what they know all the time, in meetings and interviews and performance reviews, and the talking sounds convincing and satisfies the people listening because those people are often not in a position to evaluate the gap between the talk and the actual knowledge. This was not a problem in the environments I worked in. In those rooms, the gap cost lives. Other people's lives, which is considerably worse than your own. By 30, I had been promoted to lead a unit, 11 people. The youngest was 22 and the oldest 44, and every one of them could embarrass most senior IT professionals on a bad day, and most of them were modestly quiet about it, in a way I respected deeply. We did not discuss our work outside authorized context. We did not seek recognition for what we prevented, because what we prevented was usually classified at a level that precluded recognition. We did not present at conferences or publish methodology papers. We sat in rooms and worked. And when a catastrophic thing did not happen, that would have been catastrophic if it had. We went back to our quarters and slept, and came back the next morning. I need to tell you about one specific night, because it is the night that explains the phone call. The date was the 14th of March, 9 years ago, a Tuesday. I remember because I'd been planning to call my mother on Sunday and hadn't gotten to it and was tracking the debt. The situation had been developing for 72 hours before the night I'm about to describe, but those 72 hours were preliminary. The actual moment was the night of the 14th. There's a military hospital in Germany. I won't name it. What I can tell you is that it held 312 patients that week, and a meaningful number of those patients were in units that depended on systems accessible through digital interfaces, life support, IV management, patient monitoring, medication dispensing. The systems had been installed over several years by a vendor operating under a contract that predated the security standards we now consider non-negotiable. Those systems had known vulnerabilities. The vendor had been informed. The patches had been slow. Someone found those vulnerabilities before we did. We found out they'd found them because we saw the first probe at 11:14 on the night of the 11th. It was subtle enough that the automated detection systems passed over it without a flag. I didn't. I was running a routine review of log files after hours, the kind of task that requires sustained attention and that the daytime environment is too fragmented to support properly. I flagged the anomaly and sat with it for 20 minutes and then went to find the staff sergeant who handled attribution. His name was Kevin Park. He had the specific gift of reading network behavior the way some people read faces beneath the surface, in the patterns of movement rather than the static shapes. Kevin looked at the anomaly for about 4 minutes and said, "This is not a script, Kitty." He said it quietly, the way people say things that mean more than they appear to mean. We spent the next 43 hours working backward through everything the intruder had done and forward through everything they were likely to do, building a picture of an operation more sophisticated than anything we had seen directed at a medical target. Medical facilities had been attacked before. The disruption potential was understood in our community, and so was the ethical calculation, which even serious state actors generally performed because targeting life support systems invited a level of response that served no one's strategic interest. What we were looking at did not appear to have that calculation built into it. The target was the patient monitoring network. The goal, as far as we could reconstruct it, was not data exfiltration. It was shutdown. I authorized an operational response that our commanding officer, Colonel James Whitfield, had not yet approved. Colonel Whitfield was in meetings in Brussels, and the response window I had was not measured in the hours it would have taken to reach him through proper channels. I made the call. I documented everything I was doing and every reason I was doing it, in real time with timestamps, because if I was wrong, I wanted there to be a complete record of my reasoning so the people who came after me could understand exactly where the mistake was made. I was not wrong. We stopped the attack at 4:47 in the morning on the 14th. The last intrusion attempt registered at 4:42. Kevin said, quietly, without looking up from his screen, "I think that's it." I said, "Give it 10 minutes. We gave it 10, then 20, then an hour, during which I wrote the initial incident report, and Kevin fell asleep at his desk with his head on his folded arms, which he had earned. At 6:15, Colonel Whitfield called from Brussels. He said, "I heard." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Is it over?" I said, "I believe so." He said, "You made a call." I said, "I did." There was a particular kind of quiet on the line, not the quiet of anger, which I had heard enough of to distinguish. This was closer to the quiet of someone choosing words very carefully. He said, "The call was correct." I said, "Thank you, sir." He said, "It needs to be in the report that you made it without authorization. That's the rule, and I'm not changing the rule for this." I said, "I understand. It's already in the report." He said, "Good." And then he said something I have turned over in my mind many times since. He said, "People will spend a long time not knowing this happened. Don't let that make you think it didn't." I thought about that sentence on the drive back to my apartment. I thought about it 3 years later when I was processing my separation from the service. I thought about it on the day I sat across from a recruiter at a consulting firm in Chicago who asked me to describe a time I had demonstrated leadership under pressure and I sat trying to figure out how to answer without violating a classification. And the best I could manage was, I once had to make a time-sensitive decision with incomplete information and significant consequences. The recruiter wrote something on his pad. He said, "Great." Then he moved to the next question. "I got the job. I don't know if that answer helped. Why I left the army requires a little more explanation because people always assume something went wrong, and they're not entirely wrong, but it's more specific than that." Colonel Whitfield retired in the spring of my 8th year of service. He was 62 and had been doing this work for 31 years, and his knees had been giving him trouble since a training accident in the late 90s, and his wife had been asking him to come home for longer than was fair to keep asking. He submitted his retirement paperwork in February, and it was effective in May, and on his last day he said goodbye to each member of the unit individually, which not everyone does. When he got to me, he shook my hand and held it a beat longer than a handshake usually lasts. He said, "The work you do matters, even when no one can say so." I said, "I know, sir." He said, "I mean that. Not as a thing you're supposed to believe. As a fact I have personal knowledge of." I said, "I know." He looked at me for a second longer than necessary and then nodded and moved on to Kevin. His replacement was a colonel named Richard Marsh. Colonel Marsh was not wrong to think about the work the way he did. There is more than one legitimate way to run a unit like ours, but his way valued different things than I valued. He cared. In a way, Colonel Whitfield had not particularly cared about how the work looked from the outside. He wanted the unit to be something that could be presented, displayed, cited in budget justifications. None of this was unreasonable. It was simply not the environment I had built my entire operational philosophy around, and adapting to it would have required me to become a fundamentally different kind of operator. I didn't have enough time left in my service commitment to want to do that. I filed my separation papers in October and left the Army in February, after 9 years and 4 months. My tinnitus, which I had acquired during a cooling system failure in a server facility I cannot name, during a particularly bad 48 hours in which the combination of stress and heat and sleep deprivation did something irreversible to my left auditory nerve, came with me. It always comes with me. It's not loud enough to be disabling. It's just there, a thin, high sound in my left ear, most noticeable in quiet rooms. I've learned to think of it as a calibration tool. When I can hear it, I know the room is quiet enough to hear things that matter. I ended up in Chicago because a colleague named Dara, who had left the service the year before me, said the tech sector was substantial and the coffee was good and the winters were terrible, and she had found this balance acceptable. I trusted Dara's judgment. I moved in March and applied for jobs in April and started at Meridian Group in May. Meridian was an IT consulting firm with about 280 employees in the Chicago office. It did security consulting for mid-sized businesses and some state-level government contracts. Nothing federal. I was not looking for work that resembled what I had done before. I was looking for work that paid and would leave me enough mental space to figure out what came next. Derek Calloway was the director of operations. He had been at Meridian for 7 years. He had an MBA and a way of entering rooms that announced itself before he arrived. The particular presence of someone who has learned to take up more space than their body strictly requires. He was not unintelligent. People who underestimate him on the basis of his surface presentation make a real mistake. He knew how to manage upward and build client relationships, and, most usefully, he had a particular skill for presenting other people's ideas in language that made the ideas sound as though they had originated in his own thinking. This is a genuine professional capability. It is enormously useful in certain organizational environments. I had just come from an environment where it wasn't, and it took me several months to correctly identify what I was watching. I started as a senior analyst. My job was to assess the security architecture of client companies and produce recommendations. I was good at it, probably better at it than the work strictly required. I wrote detailed reports. I trained junior analysts on threat identification. I developed a framework for evaluating vendor security practices that 2 analysts told me later they were still using at jobs they took after leaving Meridian. The first indication of the problem with Derek came in August, 3 months in. Meridian had a client, a regional logistics company, experiencing what they believed were isolated IT failures, systems going down, recovery times longer than expected, missing data attributed to user error. I spent 2 days examining the pattern and identified it as a low-grade ransomware variant moving laterally through the network, slowly enough that automated detection tools hadn't caught it yet. It was going to be obvious within a week and catastrophic within 2. I wrote the report, I sent it to Derek, and copied the client liaison. The following Monday, Derek presented the findings to the client. He used the language of my report almost verbatim. He described the threat, outlined the remediation steps, and accepted the client's gratitude for catching something their previous vendor had missed. He mentioned the team once, in passing, as though the team were a collective resource that had been deployed rather than a specific person who had spent 40 hours tracing a specific threat through a specific network architecture. I did not make a scene. I mentioned it to Priya, my deskmate, who said, "That's just what he does?" and gave me the look of someone who has been watching this happen for longer than you have and knows there's a specific stage of disillusionment you have to pass through before you're ready to hear what comes next. Priya and I had been at Meridian for 4 years when I arrived. She was a data analyst with a talent for appearing invisible in hallways that I respected enormously and that she deployed with tactical precision. She made the bad office coffee tolerable by finding a French press in the back of a cabinet and refusing to relinquish it. She noticed things. She told me things. She had a way of delivering information that was both completely accurate and timed for maximum usefulness, which is rarer than it sounds. What followed over the next 11 months was a pattern. I would produce work. Derek would present it. Attribution would go to the team or the department, or occasionally Derek's own experience and instincts, of which he had a great deal. My name appeared in internal documentation. It did not appear in the places that mattered. There was a time I identified a zero-day vulnerability in a client's payroll software and spent a weekend building a temporary isolation protocol that kept the client's operations running while the vendor developed a patch. Derek sent the client a note on Monday morning explaining that Meridian's team had gone above and beyond over the weekend to protect their systems. He copied the client's CEO. He did not mention that the team, in this case, was me, working from my kitchen table for 16 hours on Saturday and 9 hours on Sunday on a problem that had no precedent in Meridian's existing playbook. There was the time I trained the junior analyst on a new threat identification methodology I had developed over 6 weeks of after-hours work. I ran 4 sessions. I wrote the training materials. Derek presented the methodology at a department meeting as an example of Meridian's commitment to staying ahead of the evolving threat landscape. He used my slides. He changed the title slide. He pronounced 3 of the technical terms slightly incorrectly, in a way that suggested he had read them but not heard them spoken aloud by someone who knew what they meant. There was the time I caught a social engineering attempt targeting the firm's own accounts receivable department. A sophisticated phishing campaign had been running for 11 days before I flagged it. The firm's own IT security team had not caught it. I wrote a brief and delivered it to Derek on a Thursday morning. He forwarded it to the firm's partners on Thursday afternoon with a note that said the operations team had identified a significant internal security concern, and he wanted to make sure everyone was aware of the excellent work being done. I was in the hallway when one of the partners stopped Derek to say, "Great catch." Derek said, "We try to stay proactive." I did not make a scene. I did not go to HR. I mention it now because the pattern matters to the story, not because I was accumulating a grievance. A grievance would have required me to expect something different. I had stopped expecting something different after about the 4th month. What I was doing instead was waiting. I am good at waiting. I have spent a significant portion of my professional life waiting for the right moment to act, and the skill transfers. I want to be precise about what I'm saying and what I'm not. I'm not saying I couldn't advocate for myself. I can communicate clearly. I spent my adult life in an environment where failure to communicate clearly and accurately was a threat to the mission. What I learned over those 11 months is that there are organizational dynamics in which clear communication is processed as a threat rather than an asset. And the clearer you are, the more systematically you are managed to the margins. I raised the issue with Derek directly 3 times. The first time he said, "Absolutely, of course I'll make sure it's documented." The second time he said, "I'm not sure what you mean. We credit the team." The third time he said, "Hannah, I want to have a broader conversation about your fit with our culture." That conversation was 6 weeks before the conference room. Priya told me over bad coffee on the 11th floor, 2 Tuesdays before the review meeting, that she had overheard Derek on a phone call in his office saying that Hannah was a liability and he was managing her out. She looked at me like she expected distress. I said I appreciated the heads up and poured the rest of my coffee down the drain because it truly was very bad. She also told me, in the same conversation, about a document she had seen on the shared drive. A proposal, federal contract, Department of Defense level, cybersecurity consulting. She had seen a document she had not been supposed to see and had absolutely read. She said the methodology in the proposal looked familiar. Very familiar. Like a thing Hannah put together in September. I said, "The vendor assessment framework." She said, "The vendor assessment framework." I said, "Okay." She said, "Are you going to do something about this?" I said, "I'm going to wait and see how it plays out." She gave me a look that communicated several things at once, none of them endorsements of the waiting and seeing approach. But she had known me long enough to understand that when I said I was waiting to see something, I had a specific thing in mind. What I was waiting to see was whether Derek's proposal would get anywhere. Contracts at that level didn't go to firms like Meridian without significant technical vetting. The methodology in his proposal was built for a threat landscape I had spent 9 years operating in. If anyone on the evaluation side looked at it carefully enough, they would ask questions Derek couldn't answer. The morning of the conference room, I had been awake since 4. At 4 in the morning, I had found an anomaly in Meridian's network traffic. I had been running a review that I did routinely after hours because it required the kind of sustained attention that the daytime environment couldn't support. The anomaly was subtle, not subtle enough for me. I sat with it for 20 minutes and then I started building an analysis. The structure of the probe was familiar in a way that had nothing to do with anything I had learned at Meridian. It was familiar because I had seen a version of it 9 years ago in the log files of a military hospital in Germany. I spent 3 hours between 4 and 7 in the morning documenting what I was seeing. At 7:15, an automated calendar invite arrived in my inbox for a 9 o'clock meeting with Derek and Linda from HR. I knew what that meant. I saved my analysis to an external drive I kept in my bag, closed the laptop, changed into fresh clothes, and went to the conference room. And Derek explained the fundamental qualities of a leader. And my phone vibrated. The hallway had a window that looked out over the Chicago skyline. It was gray that morning, the lake invisible behind low cloud. I answered the call. The voice on the other end was Colonel James Whitfield, retired 3 years. His voice sounded exactly as it had at 6:15 in the morning on the 14th of March, 9 years ago, calling from Brussels to say the call was correct. He said, "Hannah." I said, "Colonel." He said, "I know you're not in this world anymore. I'm sorry to reach out outside a formal process, but we have a situation and you were asked for specifically because you have direct operational knowledge of what we're looking at." I said, "What are you looking at?" He said, "We have activity across 3 installations. The signature is..." He paused. He said, "It's close to something you've seen before." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've already seen it." I said, "I saw something this morning. A private network, not military infrastructure, but the same structural signature. I've been building an analysis since 4th. He said, "We need you." I said, "I'm currently being fired." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Don't be. Can you give me 20 minutes? He said, "We'll need you on a call in 40. He gave me a secure line number. I wrote it on the back of a receipt I found in my blazer pocket. He said, "Hannah, thank you. I know this is not..." "I know." I said, "It's fine. I'll call you in 40. I hung up. I stood in the hallway. The tinnitus was doing what it does in quiet spaces. I breathed for a moment. Then I went back in. Derek looked up with the expression of someone whose performance has been interrupted mid-act and who considers this a personal offense. Linda had added to her notepad. She had underlined something. I sat down. Derek said, "Hannah, this kind of behavior is exactly what we've been documenting. Walking out of a formal review process to take a personal call represents a fundamental..." I said, "It wasn't a personal call." He said, "It doesn't matter what it was, the professional behavior." I said, "It was the Pentagon." He stopped. I said, "I need to use this conference room for the next 35 minutes. There is a situation that requires my immediate attention, and I was specifically requested by name by the officer coordinating the response. After that, I will come back and we can finish this conversation." He said, "What?" I said, "I'll need everyone out. It's a secure call and the specifics cannot be overheard." Linda was looking at me, then at Derek, then at her notepad. Derek said, "Hannah, you work in corporate IT consulting." I said, "I used to do something else." He said, "You can't just take over a conference room for a personal..." I said, "Derek, I need the room. Do I have the room?" The thing about Derek Calloway is that he had spent 7 years at Meridian constructing a version of authority that rested on one foundational assumption, that he was the most consequential person in any conversation he was part of. That assumption had served him well for a long time. It was not serving him in this moment, and he was watching it become useless in real time. His face went through several adjustments. Then he stood up. He said, "We are not finished." I said, 20 minutes? He walked out. Linda gathered her legal pad and her pen and her 4 words and walked out behind him. I closed the conference room door. Priya was in the hallway. She had been getting coffee from the kitchen, approximately 6 meters from the conference room door, and she had witnessed the emergence of Derek and Linda from said conference room, with expressions she later described as two people who had not expected to be expelled from a room they had convened. She told me Derek stood in the hallway for a full minute without speaking. She thought it was either shock or strategic recalculation, possibly both. I made the call. What happened on that call is not mine to describe in full. I can tell you it lasted 31 minutes. I used the analysis I'd built between 4 and 7 as a foundation and walked the technical team through the signature comparisons in detail. The activity at the 3 installations was consistent with a probe and map operation in its early stages. The window for intervention was not unlimited. I agreed to provide remote consulting support for 72 hours. I would need a specific software environment and connectivity that Meridian's network couldn't provide, but which I could establish through other means. I also told Colonel Whitfield about the anomaly I'd found in the Meridian traffic. I told him the structure of the probe on a private corporate network matched the pattern they were seeing on military infrastructure. He said, "Hannah, are you telling me someone ran a probe on your employer's network?" I said, "That's what the documentation indicates." He said, "You need to transmit that documentation to us." I said I would. When the call ended, I sat in the conference room for 2 minutes and looked at the Chicago skyline and thought about the 4 words on Linda's notepad: documentation, policy, 30 days, appeal. Then I walked out. Derek had not moved far. He was in the hallway. Priya was at the kitchen doorway with a coffee cup she was not drinking from. She looked at me. I gave her a look. I hoped communicated. Everything is fine, and also I will explain everything. And I turned to Derek. I said, "I'm not going to be fired today." He said, "The review process is..." I said, "The Pentagon has engaged me as a consulting resource for an active situation. The engagement begins immediately and runs 72 hours. I will be working from this building or remotely. That's my operational call." I also need to flag something about the network traffic I analyzed this morning. There was a probe. I have documented it. I'll need to transmit that documentation through a secure channel, not Meridian's internal systems. Derek said, "You reviewed the network traffic." I said, "Yes, I do that regularly. It's part of the work." He said, "That's not in your job description." I said, "I know." Linda said something about taking a moment to regroup. I said, "I thought that was a good idea." I went back to my desk. Priya was already there. She looked at me with an expression that said, "I heard approximately 40% of that and need the other 60% immediately." I said quietly, "I need you to pull the proposal, the DoD document. I need a copy on a drive." She said, "Are you going to use it?" I said, "I may need it as documentation." She said, "Okay." She did not ask further questions. This is one of Priya's most valuable professional qualities. She has an excellent instinct for when more questions are not the right move. Over the next 72 hours, I did not think about the performance review or the 4 words on the yellow notepad or Derek's expression in the hallway. I worked. I had set up an isolated workstation within 4 hours of the call, operating in a controlled environment with connectivity routed outside Meridian's network. I ran 4-hour sleep intervals. I ate from vending machines and a sandwich place 2 blocks away that was open until midnight. Priya brought me coffee from the French press she had claimed from the back cabinet, which was genuinely good. The work itself was the kind of work I had not done in 4 years and had never stopped knowing how to do. It is a strange thing to step back into a mode of thinking you have been away from. You expect to have to warm up, to recalibrate, to spend time getting to speed. What I found, and what I suspect anyone who has done serious operational work over a sustained period will recognize, is that the thinking comes back immediately. It's not like muscle memory, which degrades with disuse. It's more like a language you grew up speaking. You can go years without using it, and the moment someone addresses you in it, the words are already in your mouth. I worked through the signature analysis for 6 hours on the first day, mapping the probe architecture against the documented behavior from 9 years ago and building a probability model for the next phase of the operation. The variations were significant enough to rule out a simple replay attack. Someone had taken the original methodology and improved it. That was itself a data point. The improvement style told you something about the source, about the developmental environment the attack had come out of, about how the original approach had been studied and adapted. I wrote up the analysis in the secure format I'd been given and transmitted it at 11 in the evening. The response came back in under an hour. They had been seeing the same thing from their end. The analysis was consistent with what the three installations had independently identified. We had an alignment on the probable next move. The question was the timeline. Kevin Park, who I had not spoken to in 2 years, came onto a call on the second morning at 7. His voice was exactly the same. He said, "You saw it in a civilian network first." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's interesting." I said, "I thought so too." He said, "How's Chicago?" I said, "Cold." He said, "Still." I said, "Still." There was a brief silence of the kind that happens between people who have spent a long time in windowless rooms together and don't need to fill silence to feel that it's been filled. Then he said, "Okay, so here's what I'm seeing." And we worked for the next 4 hours straight without another personal word between us. That is the thing I could not explain to a performance review. That is the thing I could not demonstrate in a meeting by raising my hand and owning the conversation. The 4 hours Kevin and I spent on that call were not visible. They did not produce a slide deck or a deliverable with a meridian letterhead. What they produced was the analytical foundation for an interdiction that happened the following morning. I was not in the room when the interdiction happened. I was at my isolated workstation, eating a granola bar from the 11th floor vending machine. I found out it had worked when Colonel Whitfield called on Thursday afternoon. On the evening of the first day, she told me what she had found when she went back to the shared drive to retrieve the proposal document. She said it had been deleted. She put a drive on my desk and walked back to her coffee station without elaborating. She had already made a copy before it disappeared. I plugged in the drive that night. Priya had been right about the proposal. The vendor assessment framework I had built in September was there, reproduced in its entirety in an appendix. The surrounding language had been adjusted. A few terms changed, but the structure, the logic, the specific sequence of assessment categories, the weighting system, the threat scoring matrix, all of it was mine, every line of it. My name appeared nowhere in the document. There was an acknowledgement section thanking the Meridian Operations team. That was as close as it came. I sent a copy to Colonel Whitfield's secure contact that night with a short note. The note said, "You may receive a proposal from a firm called Meridian Group regarding a DoD cybersecurity contract. The methodology in the appendix was developed by me. I wanted you to have this context before the proposal is reviewed." He responded in under 20 minutes. The response said only, "Understood. Thank you." The 72 hours ended on a Thursday morning. The situation at the three installations had been contained. I won't describe what was done because the details are not mine to describe. What I can tell you is that the operation was interdicted before it reached the stage at which it would have become critical, and that the analysis I contributed was described to me by people in a position to evaluate it as significant. Colonel Whitfield called Thursday afternoon. He said, "The team asked me to pass along their thanks." I said, "Tell Kevin Park his pattern recognition has not deteriorated." There was a pause, and then Colonel Whitfield laughed, which was a sound I had not heard in years, and which was exactly what I remembered. He said, "I'll tell him." Then he said, "Hannah, there's something we need to discuss." He said, "We received a proposal from Meridian Group 2 months ago." He said it in the particular way of someone who wants to give you the opportunity to respond before they continue. I said, "I know about the proposal." He said, I said, "I've seen the document. I sent you a copy on Tuesday night." He said, "Yes, you did." He said, "Are you aware that the framework in the appendix is identical to a document we have on file?" I said, "What do you mean, on file?" He said, "After Operation Night Fence, you filed a methodology document as part of the post-operation review, a full technical accounting of the assessment approach you had developed and used during the response. It's in the classified record, Hannah. It has your name on it. It was filed 9 years ago." I had not forgotten that document, but I had not thought about it as something still actively traceable, still sitting in a record somewhere with my name attached to it. I had filed it because Colonel Whitfield required a complete methodology accounting after every significant operation, and I had written down everything I had done and every reason I had done it, and it had gone into the file. The framework I built at Meridian was not the same document. It was a civilian adaptation, but it had been built by the same person using the same foundational logic, and anyone who read both documents side by side would immediately understand their relationship. I said, "The Meridian proposal uses a civilian version of the same framework." He said, "We know. And because you filed the original 9 years ago, the chain of provenance is not complicated to establish." I said, "What happens to the proposal?" He said, "It will not be approved. There may be additional consequences. I'm not in a position to specify them at this point." He said, What I can tell you is that if you were interested in a consulting engagement at the level this contract was intended to fund, there is a legitimate path to that, a direct path, one that doesn't run through Meridian. I said, I'd be interested in hearing about it. He said, I thought you might be. I went back to Meridian on Friday morning, not because I had to, because there were things I wanted to do in person. I went to Derek's office first. He was at his desk. He looked like someone who had not slept well in 3 days, which was fair because I also hadn't slept well in 3 days. I had the advantage of having spent those 3 days doing work I was built for in conditions I knew how to operate in. He had spent them waiting. I said, the proposal isn't going through. He said, what? I said, the Meridian DoD contract proposal. It's not going to be approved. He said, how do you know that? I said, because I know the people reviewing it, and I know what they found when they compared the methodology in the appendix to a document that has been in a classified archive for 9 years. A document with my name on it. He was quiet. I said, I'm not here to create problems for you, Derek. What you did was wrong. I think part of you knows that. The consequences of it are going to be whatever they are, and that's outside my control. What I wanted to say to you directly is this. The performance review, the documentation, Linda's notepad, those things are done. I'm resigning, effective today. I'll have the letter to HR within the hour. He said, Hannah, I said, I don't have anything else to say about the last 14 months. I'm done. He said, the network probe you flagged. Did you? I said, I transmitted the documentation through appropriate channels. Meridian's security team will receive a briefing from a federal contact. Your systems are not compromised. You're welcome. I walked out of his office and went to my desk. Priya was already there. She had a box. She was packing things into it. I said, what are you doing? She said, I'm quitting. Don't try to talk me out of it. I said I wasn't going to. She said, I have been at this firm for 4 years. And the best thing that happened in those 4 years was watching Derek Calloway walk out of his own conference room with a face like a man who has just been informed that gravity works differently. Then he thought, I am taking that memory with me and leaving before anything good gets canceled out by something mediocre. I said, that's fair. She said, I also want a job. I said, I don't have a company yet. She said, yet. I said, yet? Yes. She said, I'll wait. She didn't wait long. The company I registered in Illinois 3 weeks later was called Reeves Security Consulting. The initial client was a federal agency I'm not going to name. The contract was for exactly the kind of work the Meridian proposal had been intended to fund. The methodology in the engagement documentation was the civilian version of a framework that had a 9-year classified provenance establishing authorship beyond any reasonable dispute. Priya was a second hire after Dara, who I called from my apartment on a Tuesday evening and who said, I'm in, before I had finished describing what the company would do. I said, I haven't told you what it pays yet. She said, is it better than what I'm making now? I said, yes. She said, then I'm in. Derek's employment at Meridian Group ended in the late winter of that year. I don't know the specifics and wouldn't share them if I did. What I know is that the proposal was withdrawn. What I know is that questions were raised about the origin of the methodology that required documentation that could not be produced. What I know is that Derek was the responsible party for the proposal, and responsibility runs in both directions. I ran into Linda from HR at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue in the spring, about 5 months after I'd left. She recognized me. I said hi. She said hi. She looked mildly uncomfortable. I asked how things were. She said, different. I said, change can be good. She said yes, and I paid for my coffee and left. I did not feel anything particular about the encounter. That's the nature of a chapter that is genuinely closed. You can walk through its pages without them reopening. It's just a record now. It happened and then it was done. The company has grown. We have 11 people now, which is the same number as the unit I ran in the Army. Though the comparison only goes so far. The work requires different things from people than uniform service does, and I try to remember that when I'm setting expectations. What doesn't change is the standard for the work itself. Either you know what you're doing or you don't, and in this field, the difference will surface eventually, whether you help it along or not. We work with clients who range from having a sophisticated understanding of the threat landscape to having almost none, and I've learned that the gap in understanding does not necessarily correlate with the sophistication of the threats they face. Some of our most complex engagements have been with clients who did not know enough to know what they were dealing with. That is, in my view, the point. You hire expertise because it can see what you cannot see. You don't hire someone who tells you what you already know. You hire someone who tells you what you were going to find out the hard way if they hadn't been there. Priya runs our intelligence and analysis function. She hired 2 people in the 2nd year who share her gift for finding things in information environments that are not supposed to be visible. She claims she didn't know this was a specialized skill before she joined the company. I believe she is lying about this. Dara runs operations. She has the same quality Kevin Park had, which is that she communicates very precisely and very little, and you learn to pay close attention to the things she does say because they are never the things you were already thinking. Colonel Whitfield came to the opening of that office in the spring of the year after I founded the company. Kevin Park drove down from a base I won't name and stood in the doorway looking at the door with the company name on the glass and said, 9 years and 4 months of all of that, and you call it Reeves Security Consulting. I said, what would you have called it? He said, something cooler. I said, no. He stood there a moment longer. He said, 9 years. I said, 4 months and 11 days. He shook his head slowly. He said, you know what the first thing I thought was when I heard you'd started a company? I said, no. He said, I thought, she'll be fine. She's always been fine. She just needs a room with the right problem in it. I thought about that for a second. I said, that might be the most accurate description of me I've ever heard. He said, I know. He went to get a drink. Kevin Park has never in his life needed a compliment to land for it to count. There were a few clients at the opening. A new client's representative, who had been briefed on my background in general terms, asked me at some point in the evening what the most significant operation I had ever worked was. I said I couldn't discuss the specifics. He said, can you give me a sense of the scale? I said, the consequence was measured in human lives. He said, how many? I said, 312, approximately. He sat with that for a moment. He said, and nobody knows about this. I said, some people know. He said, not the public. I said, not the public. He said, doesn't that bother you? I thought about what Colonel Whitfield had said on the morning of March 15th, calling from Brussels before the sun came up. People will spend a long time not knowing this happened. Don't let that make you think it didn't. I said, no, it doesn't bother me. He said, why not? I said, because the people in that hospital don't know their lives were at risk that week. They had no idea. They slept through it. They woke the next morning and their monitors were running and their IV lines were flowing and they called their families and ate their hospital breakfast and complained about the noise from the hallway. None of that changed because no one announced it. Their aliveness was not conditional on anyone knowing about it. He said, but your career... I said, my career is what it is. The quiet part of the work is still the work. He thought about that for a moment and then moved on to get more Prosecco, because Priya had been in charge of refreshments, and Priya has specific views about what constitutes a celebration. Derek called me in the summer, about 8 months after I left Meridian. I answered because I was curious. He said he'd heard the company was doing well. I said, yes. He said, I wanted to say... He stopped. He said, I know I wasn't fair to you. I said, no. He said, I thought you were. He stopped again. I said, you thought I was background. He said, yes. I said, I know. He said, I'm sorry. I said, I appreciate that. There was a pause, and then I said, Derek, did you ever understand why the framework worked? He said, what do you mean? I said, you used the methodology in the proposal. Did you understand why it worked? He said, I thought I did. I said, if you figure out the real answer to that question someday, I'd be interested to hear it. He said, okay. Then he said, Hannah. I said, yes. He said, I was wrong about the leadership thing. I said, I know. I said goodbye and went back to work. The tinnitus is still there. It will probably always be there. I've stopped thinking of it as a reminder of something that cost me. I think of it now as a kind of calibration instrument. When a room is quiet enough that the thin, high sound in my left ear is the only thing I hear, I know I'm in the right place, attending to the right things. The quiet is where the important work lives. There are things that happen in this world that no one announces. Threats stopped before they become events. Attacks that never complete because someone was awake at 4 a.m. reading log files, or spent 72 hours in a room with no windows making the right calls, or acted without authorization because the window was closing and the person who understood what was happening was there and the person who could authorize it was not. These things produce no ceremony, no headlines, no visible performance of leadership for the people upstairs to evaluate. They produce a quiet that most people don't recognize as anything other than the absence of noise. That quiet is not nothing. That quiet is, in most of the cases that actually matter, everything. The people who hold that quiet are not failing to speak. They are speaking in the only language the work requires. The loudest thing I ever did was sit in a room for 72 hours and refuse to stop. I have never found a way to put that on a resume, and I have stopped trying. What I have learned, and what this story is about, is not that quiet people eventually get their moment in a conference room when their phone rings and a colonel's voice comes through it and a boss has to leave his own meeting. That's a story about timing, and timing is luck. What I have learned is this: the work you do matters regardless of who is watching. The lives you protect do not require your name to remain alive. The framework you build does not require your byline to function. You know what you know, and you did what you did, and that is true whether or not it is on a legal pad with 4 underlined words and a pocket square that matches nothing. The quietest people in the room are often the ones the room cannot function without. This will not always be obvious. It may not be obvious for years. It may not become obvious until a number with a 571 area code appears on a screen at the worst possible moment, and someone on the other end says your name and the word "we need you," and you find out that the room has always known, even when it looked like it didn't. Silence is not the same thing as absence, and the people who know the difference are the ones worth listening to.